Thank you for having me speak here and allowing me to tell my story. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not used to microphone here in front of me. Okay, actually, I think they ran out of speakers and asked me to. I was asked today to speak about an event in my nursing career with an ethical conflict. Actually, there have been many incidents where I did not agree with physicians or with the administration of some hospitals. But I quickly learned to keep my mouth shut, when to compromise, and when to speak up. Most often, my decisions have been intuitive. My mantra being, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. So I went into nursing quite by accident. After 10 years of running a household with 4 babies while suffering from acute homesickness, I was looking for work with little prospects. I had no work experience, I had no skills, my English was terrible. So I went to SUNY Farmingdale, where the advisor said to me, "How about nursing?" School was a godsend. I loved it from the first class. So I went to school from Monday through Thursday from 5 to 10. I have to tell you this because it was quite a packed schedule. 5 to 10 p.m., 4 days a week. During the day, I took care of my family, 4 babies. And on weekends, I worked 3 to 11 as a nurse's aide in a nearby hospital. Now, I came to the realization when I started working that working is nothing compared to running a household. I thought it was a piece of cake, even though I had this strenuous schedule. My then husband had the job. That was it. Anyway, I liked nursing. The idea of not getting emotionally involved, though, with my patient hardly ever worked for me. I always believed, and I still do, that the nursing profession has to be a calling. Those people that go into that line of job, it's really a job for them, and they quickly find the workload is too heavy. They don't want to get their hands dirty, and they move into positions in administration. The physical contact to me was particularly important, giving a back rub, giving a bed bath, holding somebody's hand, gave me an opportunity to listen to my patients and knowing everything that was going on with them. In my days, when there was a code, and I worked in critical care for 40 years, the nurses ran the code. We didn't have time to call the attending physician in the middle of the night. So we pretty much ran everything. My supervisor once told me, "You don't always want to be a bedside nurse. You know, you have credentials, you know, you can move up, be a supervisor." But that's exactly what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a bedside nurse, taking care of patients. And that was also one of the reasons why I went into critical care. They had then 12-hour shifts, and I could really pace myself and meet all my patients' needs, something that wasn't possible on a regular floor. So my first position as an RN, a new graduate nurse, was at a psychiatric hospital close to my home. This was in the early 70s. The unit I was assigned to had a population of geriatric mentally ill. Some were placed there by their families permanently. I have to give you a little bit background as far as my personal life at that time. When I immigrated to this country, I was a naive, immature, unsophisticated 21-year-old. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. All right. I came right out of a German college called the Pädagogische Hochschule, which is a teaching college. Never held a job, never was away from home. I married a black GI, and I was going to live happily ever after. Coming from a country where everyone looked like me, I had no idea about racism, anti-Semitism, segregation, working for a living, and politics in general. My school English was minimal at best. In fact, when I first came here, it took me months before I dared to answer the phone. My then husband told me, get a job. What do you mean, get a job? I just got here, I married you. You're supposed to take care of me. I didn't say any of those things. He found me a job at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn as a nurse's aide. I looked at the nurses there with great admiration, and I thought if only I could be a nurse. Now, this was just 16 years after the end of World War II. Many physicians there were Jewish refugees from Europe. They told me about their personal experiences from their tortures, beatings, loss of family members. I got first-hand reports of what Germans had done to them and started to feel personally responsible and ashamed of being German. Until then, I had learned about World War II, 6 million Jews murdered, millions of German soldiers fallen or missing, the post-war suffering of the civilian population was enormous. So the national emphasis in Germany was into rebuilding and healing. And what actual crimes were committed during the Nazi time was rarely discussed and hardly ever spoken about in schools. So my job at Kings County Hospital didn't last very long. When I became pregnant, I stopped working. For the next 10 years, my focus was mostly on my 4 children. They saved me from utter desperation. I missed Germany terribly. Everything was better there. The food, the traditions, the music, everything. I was so homesick. So getting back to my first real job at the psychiatric hospital, and I tell you, I have to preface my story by telling you that I was really ill-prepared. My medical and psychological training was terrible. And what we learned in retrospect, I, after all, had a 2-year nursing program from Farmingdale. And what we learned there were things like, if a mother doesn't spend enough time with her infant during the first year, she causes schizophrenia. If the mother, however, spends too much time with her child during the first year, he turns out to be gay. It was always the mother's fault, but this is what we actually learned in Psychology 101. It seemed always the mother's fault. But to demonstrate my, my personal general ignorance that first year, we had a cardiac arrest in the unit. Now, this is a psychiatric hospital with old people, so not a lot was being done. But a panicked psychiatrist handed me an EKG and said, "Can you please interpret this for me?" No. Another example, we had a suicidal violinist from the Philadelphia Orchestra. And I thought it was a good idea to bring my daughter's violin, only for him to threaten to smash it over the head of his psychiatrist. Not smart. Nonetheless, I stayed at this hospital for 4 years while I continued my education and eventually became a critical care nurse. So my job at this psychiatric hospital was to give out medication to already over-medicated patients. They would come shuffling down the hall to my desk, swallow their pills or not, and return stuporous back to their room. The whole scene seemed very depressing. I was wondering how I could make the days more interesting and maybe also stimulating to my patients. So I decided to bring in my classical records. And on Sunday mornings, I brought in the New York Times and started to read to my patients. At first, only a couple showed interest, but soon, to my surprise, our living room area became crowded every Sunday morning. I realized how deprived these patients were and how quickly and how positively they responded to the least stimulus. There was one woman in particular who was of interest to me. She was a German immigrant in her early 70s, who I had seen always walking silently up and down the hallways, always wringing her hands, not speaking to anybody. Her file told me that she came from my hometown, Hamburg. I started gently approaching her, speaking in English, afraid of frightening her if I spoke German to her. But eventually we spoke German, and slowly, over the next months, she began to talk, and I learned what brought her to this place. Paula was the daughter of a Jewish merchant from Hamburg. She and her 3 sisters grew up in an upper middle class environment, volunteering in social services in their community. During the late 1930s, the 4 young women became active members of the underground resistance, transporting children via Kindertransport by way of Denmark to London. It took many weeks, months, for Paula to relate in tidbits the horrors she and her sisters endured. I would sit with her during my free moments while she would whisper her story to me. Some family members fled to Palestine. Paula's parents refused to leave Germany and perished. Paula and her sisters could have saved themselves, but chose to expose themselves to unimaginable dangers to save children until only she was left. Her 3 sisters were captured along with truckloads of children and were shipped to be murdered. Paula was the sole survivor and was eventually rescued by Allied troops. She moved to England, where she worked as a social worker with Jewish children, until she immigrated to the United States, where she continued her work in social work in Queens. She was 70 years when one day a man high on drugs came into her office and attacked her with a knife. A co-worker came to her rescue, but he was fatally stabbed in front of Paula. That day, she collapsed and stopped talking. Now, in the early 70s, psychiatric care was not as advanced and often just consisted of custodial care in some institution. Paula was placed in the hospital where I met her later. Over the next years, Paula and I had become very close. I soon started to get permission to spend time with her during my off-duty hours. We took walks by the ocean. She sat in my garden. We read together, went out to lunch. We listened to music. I asked permission to take her to concerts, to the opera, which she loved. We heard Beethoven's Missa Solemnis at Carnegie Hall, and she sang the Kyrie all the way back to my car. She sang on the way home from an Aida performance. She sat in my garden and played with my 6-year-old son, who adored her. The psychiatrists were amazed at her change and progress after what had been diagnosed as a complete mental and physical breakdown. Paula blossomed, although she still had occasional psychotic episodes and needed treatment. When I once came back from a trip to Germany, she rushed to me, took me in her arms and said, "Oh, my darling, I thought the guards had caught you at the border." She told me once, "When I close my eyes, I'm in Nazi Germany." It so happened that this was the time when psychiatric hospitals would empty their facilities. It was in the late 70s and early 80s. Hundreds, maybe thousands of families were suddenly faced with dealing with severely mentally handicapped people. At this time, Paula's doctors and the administration of her hospital pressured me, and I mean pressured me, to take Paula home permanently. What would you have done?
As we had noted when I was introducing Elke, you are invited to share what you would have done and why. So please feel free to raise your hand. We can have you come up. We'll use the mic. Of course, anyone in the Zoom room is welcome as well.
Yeah, so the question really is, would you have taken on a family member with severe mental health problems? Maybe some of you, you all look too young to be around at that time, but in the 80s, Arthur. Yes, I will. Yes, my children were still, and I was raising. My youngest was maybe 8, and my oldest just started college.
We can't hear the questions.
Okay, Arthur is asking what was my family situation. And of course, at this point, I was a single mother with 4 children and working full-time at North Shore University Hospital in the critical care unit. But I struggled with the prospect. And of course, you know, there were many cases, patients that really weren't that sick, that just family didn't want to be bothered with, and they wound up homeless during that time. So I was, yes?
Did she have any other, alternatives?
That's the question, Elke. Were there any alternatives to, what was the alternative?
Paula had no family that I was aware of. They just were going to relent and hope for the best, yeah. But I wanted to also address the homeless problem. Yeah, okay.
This is Dorcas. I wasn't born here, so when they were releasing all the sick people, why were they releasing them into the world? What had happened with the medical facilities?
I remember when Pilgrim State here on Long Island suddenly emptied out. I don't remember what the political situation it was.
I remember that the government didn't want to pay to house these people and to feed them, and so they just let them out on the street.
Actually, I can confirm what was being said one moment, that at that time I was in social work as well, in social work school. And what they did was that they would just take a busload of people out of Pilgrim State and dump them in Long Beach, among other places. And Long Beach became a dumping ground for well, at that point they were considered ex-psychiatric patients. But that was not where your heart was, I suspect, as it related to Paula.
No, that was not the case. I was involved in that process. It was the deinstitutionalization movement, which was brought on by horrors like Willowbrook. And as a result of that, they felt they would substitute a program of local residences where they would be housed and treated. They never came up with that. And as a result, they did the deinstitutionalization without the program, which would be very costly, of local residences that would be not like the institution. So what you saw was the corruption of a good idea, which just left those individuals on the street. And what they did build were places where they could get medication. But of course, they would have to initiate that, and the result was, so what would you do? What would I do? I faced situations like this in my own career. There were dozens of times that there were children in my classes that I would like to take home with me for a variety of reasons. In their home lives were destructive. The same thing was true with my wife, Karen. And I didn't. And why is that I did not have the resources to effectively do that. In other words, I couldn't become an alternate home for dozens of children. No.
So you would not have been able to take her in, is what I'm hearing. Okay, okay.
As the same with Mr. Israel, I was also a teacher and faced similar situations. And eventually I did take one home, but my kids were already older. So I think the deciding factor for me was the 8-year-old at home. I probably would not have done it. But just to add another piece of information, I believe at the same time they were deinstitutionalizing, they were also doing least restrictive environment. And that led to the release of many patients also. So it was a difficult time. Thank you, Elke. It was great.
First of all, I just have to say, Elke, that was such an incredible story, so moving. And for me personally, with my mother coming out of the Holocaust experiences, you know, from Vienna on the Kindertransport, I mean, it had a special meaning and a depth to me. Thank you. There were so many factors that could come into this decision. It's a very complex decision. Certainly one would be what your feelings really were, what you felt your limitations were. One thought I had was, would it have been possible for you to have a conversation with Paula and perhaps even with your kids all together or separately to see what their thinking and feeling was? And on the basis of all that and other factors, I mean, come to some kind of a decision. It's impossible for me to know what I would have done because there are too many factors that I don't know that come into play here.
Because I will tell you what the ending of the story. Is there anybody on Zoom? Duffy.
I would want to know what facilities Paula had. The children adored her. How cogent was she? Could she have contributed? Could she have helped with the children? Could she have played a contributory role in your household?
Not really. Paula was in her 80s and she was frail, physically frail, so it would not have been a two-way relationship. But that's it, right? There's nobody there? Okay, let me tell you what I did. Okay, good. So it was just not possible for me. I had started working at North Shore University Hospital. I was a single mother with 4 children. I needed to work full time, and Paula needed constant supervision. And there was really no assistance available for me, at least I didn't know, or there was some kind of guardian who occasionally I had to ask, can I have some money? I want to buy her shoes. Can I have money for a dress? Something like that, but I don't know. There was no family available. So I arranged for her admission at an excellent nursing home nearby. Paula was now part of my family. She was like a sweet, gentle grandmother to my children. My little son would ride his bike every Sunday morning to bring her the New York Times. All family gathering included her. Things were good. Over the years, Paula had told me about extended family in Israel. And I had the idea, and I don't know if it was a good idea or not in retrospect, maybe not, but I decided to make contact with her first cousin Lotte, who also came from Hamburg. With permission from the psychiatrist, I invited Lotte and her husband Chaim to visit. Strangely, Paula became more and more withdrawn the closer their arrival became. By the time Lotte and Chaim arrived, she had totally shut down and stopped speaking again. I had been so excited that Paula would finally have some contact with some family members that I didn't consider the psychiatric implications, even though I had been spoken with the psychiatrist about this. And I started to feel guilty. Guilty is my middle name here. Lotte and Chaim stayed at my house. I invited them for a week while we visited Paula daily. She never acknowledged her cousin Lotte, always looking down at her hands in her lap. During this visit, Larry, my husband, and I would sit up late into the nights listening to their stories, how they escaped via rowboat, traveling only at night down the Danube River, how their parents also did not want to leave Germany and refused to let Lotte take her youngest brother with her to Palestine. They all perished. We listened to their stories of their courageous escape, traveling via Turkey to Palestine. They told us about their kibbutz, Mayan Tzvi, and we became lifelong friends. During our visits with Paula, she never spoke a word. I remember sitting with Lotte in the parking lot of the hospital in my car, and we were exchanging stories, both of us crying. Oops. I'm sorry. Well, I can. Anyway, Paula died in her 80s. It was over in the 1980s. The funeral was, there were two people there that I didn't know and myself. We were it. The rabbi spoke a generic speech. He was very rushed and had to get to the next funeral. Not a word about her heroic ethical life.